Hello, welcome back to URP 4741 and URP 6742. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the state of the nation's housing regarding the trend, the patterns, and the problems. The lecture will be mostly based on Chapter 2 of the textbook and also the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. Each year they publish a report called the State of the Nation's Housing. So I'm going to cover a very significant part of the conditions of the housing market during the pandemic, especially during 2020 and 2021. So overall, the housing construction trends in recent years basically follow the patterns such as cyclical. Remember, the housing market is always corresponding to the economic cycles. And sometimes it's ahead of the cycles, sometimes it's trailing the economic cycles because like what we mentioned before, housing market plays very important roles in the economic health of a community or a country. Another trend is that suburbs have more new construction compared to their city centers. And also, since the 1980s, the share of the single-family homes mostly dominates the residential construction. However, after the most recent recession, which was between 2007 and 2009, the share of single-family starts has dropped to 63%, which means you're going to have fewer new houses, and also you're going to have less inventory if the demand is strong, which could potentially drive up housing prices, particularly so during the pandemic and also in hot markets such as the South, the Northeast, the West, and the West. Another trend is the South has more new construction compared to the North and other regions in the U.S. And housing size has become larger. In 1973, the median size of owner-occupied homes was only 1,535 square feet, but in 2017, that size has increased to 2,436. Median size means the middle number, so that means half of the housing units would be larger than the median size, and half of the housing units would be lower than the median size. Another trend is the shortage of affordable housing construction. It's always a shortage. I mean, that's a persistent issue, providing affordable housing. And later I'm going to show some statistics to indicate the magnitude of the shortage. So this is just a graph from the textbook indicating their starts, single-family starts. That means basically you obtain the permits and then you just try to start building. And I think this data is based on the permits. So you can see the trend. This is between the most recent recession, and you can see all types of housing units have kind of decreased in the construction, but after the recession began to pick up again. But overall, the single family starts has decreased. You can see that during the boom in the early 2000s, the single family construction was really very strong, but then began to decline until the recession and now began to climb up, but nowhere went to the level of prior to the recession. You see the difference was pretty sharp, which means the inventories were low. That means the supply is low, and if you have higher demand, you're going to have higher prices. For multifamily and manufactured housing, they have similar trends over time as well, but much less magnitude in increases and also changes. This is just another chart to compare with the single-family housing starts and some other types of starts, and also sales, new home sales and stuff over the years. And this chart actually has some problems with the denotation, and I found that it's actually wrong. So if you look at it, this should be the housing price index. You can see the increases over time, especially after the recession. And now the housing price index already exceeded the boom years in this time period. And that is worrying if it doesn't cool down. And then that means the housing market will be heading to a cliff. And I don't know if it's going to be able to have a soft landing if it starts to cool down. I think based on the projection right now, the market begin to slowly cool down because of the increases in the mortgage interest rate and also a few other factors. And so, like what I mentioned before, the housing market followed a cyclical pattern. That means has a boom and bust, just like the economic cycle. And because it played a very important role in the economy. And I hope like next year or year after, we will not see anything major like a bust coming, but we're not quite sure. Basically, based on the prediction of National Association of Home Builders, there's about 30% chance of a recession in 2023 and 2024, but it's 30% chance. So that means it could be there, but it could not. Homeownership rate has been increasing, but during the recession began to decline, and then especially among certain groups of households has declined sharply since the boom of the mid 2000s. And also the homeownership rate, there's a gap of homeownership rates between different racial and ethnic groups, and that gap is persistent. Later I'm going to mention that over the years, not just now, it has a persistent gap. Homeowners and renters in the U.S., they have very distinctive characteristics. Overall, homeowners are a little bit older in age and usually have a little bit higher income in average. Okay, we talk about the average and characteristics, not really consider individual characteristics. So homeowners are a little bit older and may have more income, and also mostly would live in the suburbs, and also mostly would have more wealth compared to renters. Costs and benefits of homeownership rate. Homeownership, owning a home has costs and benefits. The major costs of homeownership would include, for example, the mortgage costs. In the future lectures, I'm going to mention mortgage costs. It's not just about you pay the principal and interest, but also owning a home also associated with property taxes, insurances, property insurances. Sometimes you also have to pay mortgage insurances if you did not put 20% down payment in order to get a mortgage. And sometimes you also have to pay the points in order to bring down your mortgage interest rate. Those will be covered in the Unit 2 when we talk about the housing finance, mortgages, and some other things. Cost of homeownership could also mean maintenance and improvement, because over time, housing would deteriorate. Just like anything, you're going to depreciate if you don't do any maintenance, you don't do any improvements. So those could be the costs. The benefits would be it's an asset, and it could be an investment vehicle, and it could be providing more stability, and also possibly have more benefits for their physical and mental health of their dwellers. This is just the overall trend of the homeownership rate. We can notice that over there, since the 1970s, the homeownership rate has increased sharply, especially uh, starting like 1990s and all the way to the boom. And then we have a recession here. We have a recession here, and then begin to come down homeownership rate until roughly 2016, and then now begin to slightly pick up, but it's nowhere comparable to the boom years in the early 2000s. And those just some of the bust cycles. You can see the different cycles over the years. Some are a little bit longer, some are a little bit shorter. And those the oil crisis and some other crisis in the 1970s actually drove up the interest rate really high. Later, I'm going to mention that means a large portion of income went to the mortgage payment or rent because of the interest, especially the mortgage payment. Housing conditions has improved over time. You see that from this chart in the early 1940s and 60s, housing usually the quality was not really great. You have incomplete plumbing, you have crowding, although this has not been an issue over the years. And the crowding has decreased as well, but not as much as like plumbing and some other conditions. Still, you do have a small portion of people who live in housing units with substandard conditions. We call it substandard conditions. Housing affordability has different measures, but basically, first one I'm going to mention that if a household spends more than 30% of the gross household income on housing, we say the household is cost burdened. If they pay more than 50% of their income for housing costs, that means they are severely burdened households regarding their housing costs. In 2017, about 26% of the owners and 48% renters spend more than 30% or more of the income on housing. So that means it's a pretty significant issue, especially in the future. If the mortgage interest rate begin to increase and the housing costs might also increase as well. And also persistent worsening of housing affordability during the last 4 decades, particularly among renters and low-income households, and widening economic inequality over the years. This is just a trend over the years about the percentage of rent and mortgage payment for income. You notice, like earlier I mentioned, during this time period, the interest rate was really high. Sometimes could reach to like 15% or something. If you have grandparents who owned homes at that time, you could ask them, okay, the interest rate and stuff. But then later on, the interest rate began to decrease sharply, and also there are many policies trying to promote homeownership, making getting a mortgage much easier over the time. So that means the percentage of mortgage payment among the income has been much lower over the years, especially now after recession is lower, but during the boom time, because the housing price was very expensive during that time. And then I don't know about the most recent data. I'm thinking could increase after the recession, after the pandemic. During the pandemic, the economic stimulus has helped households tremendously to avoid paying, being evicted, or to avoid being behind for mortgage payment. But once after the recession, pandemic, we're not sure the trend. So we shall see in the next few years. And those are the number of households with severe housing cost burden. You will notice that renters always have a much larger portion, large number compared to their owners. who were severely cost burdened. And this gap has been pretty wide. Like 2015 and 2017 began to shorten a little bit, and there's no most recent data, so we'll see the trend in the future. And this just indicates that we have the extremely low income renters, which means they make less than 30% of the AMI for their metropolitan area or for the county or whatever the units. So that means the extremely low income renters that are increasing in numbers and begin to stabilize a little bit, but it's has a big jump over here. But the affordable units is kind of stagnant and sometimes like decreases during this was the recession. The affordable units actually decreased because a lot of homeowners went to foreclosure, but those foreclosed units were not available. And rental, because of foreclosed households, they have to look for rental units. So they those actually drive up their rents and also make the inventory of their affordable units were lower during the recession. You see that the rent is increasing, but the inventory is decreasing. Okay, after the recession, affordable units began to increase slowly because a lot of people began to switch to being homeowners. And then you have some rental units available over the time, and then it's increasing. So that's a good sign, but still, affordable and available units has a gap. You see all three of them have a gap. And how do you really close this gap? How do you close this gap? That's a major issue that we're going to think about. This just indicates that the budget over the years for HUD to focus on housing and community development, especially the housing, has been pretty much stagnant and has a little bit trend actually going down. This is a total outlay, means the actual spending. The BOSS, the budget authority, means the budget for the year. So that means they're very close. You know, you have this budget, but you actually spend more, and also very close. And now you begin to get really like, you budget this much, you spend this much. And I hope this trend will not like going down. That means actual spending in the affordable housing and also housing subsidies would decrease over the years. And that will make it having tremendous pressure about providing affordable units. Housing affordability index, there are different measures. This is one of the measures. It's by National Association of Realtors. Basically, the formula indicating the median family income divided by qualifying income in order to get a mortgage on a typical home for the local, at a local level. So that means if you need a much higher qualifying income, and then will drive down the housing affordability index. So that means the higher their value, the more affordable it is. That means the qualifying income, you don't need much income in order to qualify to get a mortgage. So that means when this index is higher, the area is more affordable. And we can take a look at the index, like what I mentioned, the higher it is, that means it's more affordable. Midwest has been always pretty affordable. Even now, during the rising housing prices, the Midwest still is the most affordable area. The West is the least affordable, followed by the South and the Northeast. In 2021, those are the most affordable states to live in. You have, Ohio, Iowa, Kansas, Indiana, West Virginia. Those are the most affordable. The least affordable are the Idaho. Surprise, surprise, right? Idaho, Utah, California, New York, Rhode Island. It's not surprising because a lot of people, especially in the tech industries, the remote workers, they began to move into like Idaho or Utah, Salt Lake City, Boise in Idaho. That they drove up the housing price significantly. So they actually hopped onto the top list of least affordable states. So that means situations can change. You know, in 2025, they were not. They were not in the least affordable states, but now they are. Maybe in the future, situations could change again because of the other demographic drivers would change. Most affordable, least affordable metro areas for housing. The most affordable areas, most of them are in the like Midwest, and also Texas has some, Iowa. The least affordable, look at them. They are pretty much all in California. Although Miami, Fort Lauderdale, they are among the top 10, okay, but they're not among the top 5. All the top 5 metropolitan areas are located in California. This is 2019 data. Okay, so again, things could change, but California oftentimes, especially in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, San Jose, and also Los Angeles, those areas could be pretty much always not affordable. Another index is maintained by the National Association of Home Builders. For this one, it's also the larger the index is, the more affordable. The larger index is, the more affordable. So basically means the share of homes sold in that area, that would have been affordable. So that means if the share is higher, that means it's more affordable. So those were the affordability indexes and some other things. Now I'm going to switch to the state of the nation's housing. You are required to read that report, so I'm going to just briefly mention about the trend in 2021. And also remember, during 2021, we had the unprecedented time of the pandemic, so that means situations were quite different. But interestingly enough, during the pandemic, housing market was really like hot. Briefly, during the early days of the pandemic in 2020, the home sales actually dropped. But then shortly after, home sales began to increase, and also the price began to increase, and everything now becomes really expensive, especially in the South, in Northeast, and in the West. And those are just some of the trend, like continuing soaring prices because of high demand and tight supply, and also because of the changing demographic dynamics. People move during the pandemic. So that means some markets actually have very high demand and tight supply, but some markets still kind of good, okay. Homeownership rates rising, but not for all of the households. And the renter cost burdens, the worsening, it's increasing. The rent keeps increasing. Although I had to say that the pandemic, the CARES Act has helped homeowners and also renters to avoid being behind in rents and the mortgage payments. Housing constructions at new highs, but slowed down because of the supply chain disruption, and also because of the rising prices of construction materials and the inflations. And shifting location, size of new homes, suburbs would see a lot increases. So those are just some of the, and also surge in refinancing activity because the mortgage interest rate was decreased so low, which stimulated home purchasing behavior and also refinance behavior. But again, because the demand is strong, but the inventory is low, which drove up the housing prices. And this is just one example about housing prices keep increasing and inventory keeps decreasing. And those just indicate that price to income ratio already almost come back to the boom years in the early 2000s. And households with color renters are more likely to fall behind on monthly housing payments, including rents and mortgages. That was a little bit troubling, but again, the stimulus and some other direct payments to the households, and also eviction moratorium have helped tremendously to make people avoid losing their homes. So there, like what I mentioned before, in the early days of the pandemic, home sales dipped, but later on began to pick up quickly and keeps rising. And now kind of begin to cool down a little bit, but still the trend is still rising. And so the construction has been the average, but it began to dip a little bit, like when we got into 2021, because of the rising cost of construction materials, and also because of the supply chain disruption. And the lumber prices, like what I mentioned, makes it much harder increase the housing prices. And again, housing prices are climbing, even exceeding the peak times. The housing price index is exceeding. It's worrisome, right? You see this you get to the peak and now begin to drop. So what will happen if we get higher? So we don't know. We shall see. So the rents keeps increasing, has a brief dip, but then keeps increasing again. But overall, it's much slower in the increase compared to the housing prices. Those are just about, their declining interest rate have offset rising home prices. You can see like the home sale price and mortgage interest, monthly homeowner costs decline. I mean, very mild increase, but very mild. Okay. So vacancy rates increased in the urban areas, but decreased in the suburban areas. That was not surprising because the lockdowns and stay-at-home orders and the work from home, making it more challenging for like urban dwellers, especially they have small spaces. So that means households would prefer larger spaces, and also because they don't have to work in the office and they can pretty much live anywhere they can. And later I'm going to mention the remote workers could be a significant segment in the housing market because they can choose wherever they prefer to live for fully remote. And then, that might drive up the housing price in the prime locations furthermore. So we don't know for sure. The demographic drivers, basically the millennial households, they begin to form households and buying homes and stuff. So those are good signs. That means they have strong demand for homes. And like what I mentioned before, a lot of people begin to move to the suburbs, begin to move to other places because, remote work. And that could be, in the future, we're going to really try to figure out what could be the potential impacts of remote work, because remote working is staying for a lot of companies. I know many companies already went back to the office, but for a lot of tech industries and stuff, more and more people are able to work remotely, fully remotely. Like they don't have to go to the office, maybe once a few months or once a month, something like that. The pandemic has created and widened the wealth gaps. So you get all those stable families and households with stable income. They didn't lose any incomes. In addition to that, they received the stimulus payment based on the CARES Act. So that means that they are able to actually save much more than before the pandemic. That means they would have much higher wealth. But on the other side of the spectrum, then you have households who lost their jobs and who had to work in the low-paying essential industry, essential economy occupation. and then they got a low paying, and then but on the other hand, you get a high paying households and families. So the wealth gap has been widened. However, and also the pandemic also stimulated the largest shift of labor market changing, restructuring. Like many people left low-paying jobs and they try to get opportunities and find them in other sectors. So has a massive like resignation or labor market readjustment during the pandemic, and that readjustment is still going on quite strong. Sometimes the population growth has been slowing, so that could possibly decrease the demand for housing, and could possibly cool down the housing market. Those are just some of the indicators about the millennials, and also their household growth outside cities has been accelerating even before the pandemic. Some of the challenges would be the rental costs, and also persistent gaps in homeownership, and also wealth, credit access, and could be a limiting factor for a lot of people to own homes. And also, like what I mentioned before, the disparate impacts of the pandemic widening the wealth gaps, and also increased risks to households from climate change, especially related to drought, tornadoes, and also wildfires. And hopefully the hurricane season, fortunately during 2021 and 2020, the hurricanes were kind of, we were fortunate we didn't have any major hurricanes. So those are some of the challenges, and also shortage of homes for sale. Hopefully after the pandemic, when the inflation has been somewhat kind of slowing down, maybe the lumber price and construction material price would drop a little bit, so that the home construction could pick up again. And so inventories has been low, and also the single family market is still pretty strong, but because of the limitation of their lumber prices, construction material prices, and labor costs, and etc., and that slows down. The new construction slows down, and homeownership gap over the between different age groups. You can see the gap, okay, and also based on different race and ethnicity characteristics. And a lot of households will struggle to pay rent in early 2021, but because of the protection of the eviction, they benefited greatly. They were able to stay in a house, in a home. You can see the dark green states actually has the most share of renters who struggle to pay rent. Florida is not too bad. It's between this range, okay. This is much lower. It's under 12%. And this just indicates that homeowners begin to spend more and more in disaster repairs and also preparations because of their more like frequent disasters and natural climate hazards over time. I'll just briefly, I know the COVID-19 is pretty much, is behind us, and because right now the virus has been not causing very severe diseases in most healthy people. But I would like to say what we learned from the COVID-19 is, density urbanism. Urban people will still go back to urban areas, although we had a mass exodus from urban areas to the suburban and also to other areas. And are we going to consider trying to increase the ventilation, or trying to increase more green spaces and outdoor activities so that people can spend more time outdoors? Because outdoor was safer. That was the place that many households socialize and also exercise outdoors during the pandemic. Even during the lockdown, they can still go outside, and it was much safer regarding the virus, avoiding the virus. So those are some of the things that we would consider, like public transportation. Will it pick up again? Yes, I think so. But are we going to do more sanitation, disinfection, and also are we going to have more mixed use neighborhoods, and also trying to cater to more remote workers, because they may want nearby restaurants and personal services, because if they work and live at home. And also housing units would be different, the design, like many remote workers would want to be able to have a home office, or maybe the companies also have to pay for some of the costs in order to convert the offices into home offices. And those are just some examples about the building design, trying to increase circulation and interaction, the pedestrian travel, reduce contagion risks. I'm going to mention a few other trends about and also issues in the housing market. Informal housing settlements, and they do exist in the U.S. Okay, the U.S. Is a very developed country and has the world's largest GDP, but informal housing settlements exist. We have 10 cities. In large cities, the homeless population, they just set up tents in certain areas. We have the colonias, which are the informal settlements along the borders, mostly in Texas, Arizona, and California has a little bit, but most along those borders, and they're informal settlements to host workers who work in the certain industries along the borders, and also they were not able to afford to live in very decent homes. And also shanty towns, which will be more like low income, and really the housing conditions would be really bad. And those are some of the informal housing settlements in the U.S. They're not prevalent, but they do exist. And then we have this tiny housing, mini apartment movement. Some people just prefer, okay, I'm going to live in a very small, tiny home, and then we can move that home maybe on a trailer, and then we can move anywhere we want, and also can decrease the price. But there are some challenges, and also it was pretty a popular concept a few years back, but now you have not seen many kind of forward movement, because especially during the COVID, and that actually maybe made it, people did not really want to live in a small space like this, especially if they have to stay at home to work. And another major trend is the smart housing, and I'm going to mention that towards the end of the semester as well. Basically everything is connected. Everything is connected, remote control and everything. However, security could be a major issue, and privacy could be a major issue. And how do we really solve the cybersecurity? How do we solve the protect the privacy of the households? That's a major challenge to implement smart housing projects. And another trend is green buildings and neighborhoods. Basically, we have like solar panels, we have zero energy or low energy appliances, and we have low VOC construction materials, and we have all those different features to make it a green and low energy healthy, and to promote resource conservation, indoor air quality, and also water conservation, and increase energy efficiency, and make it much healthier to live in. Those are just some of the websites related to housing, and also data sources. So if you're interested in, especially in the future, if you are going to work in the planning field, you should know some of their sources. So that's it for this lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions. My email is yli22@fau.edu.